Okay, now we're recording. Okay, so we've animated a gradual acceleration, deceleration. And we can even go a bit more to show the weight. We can continue with very slow changes. Slower, 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 and slower, and slower, and slower, and hold. And let's pinpoint it. Okay, so held it for, I don't know, what, 60, 70, whatever. Okay, so this was more or less gradual acceleration. Let's move on to the faster, more stylized acceleration, deceleration. How do I figure out how many frames the image will be held for? Does it depend on the spacing? Yes, it depends on the spacing and it depends on the animation. There's no rule for figuring out for how long the image will be held for. Right now I'm animating on once, and there is pretty much not a big difference which spacing do I use, since we don't have a specific purpose in mind. Like the speed heavily depends on what is the scene, what are you trying to animate. Is it real-time fire? Is it, I don't know, is it slow motion? Or is it anything else? In general though, you kinda get a sense of spacing for certain elements as you get more experience. So you tend to animate, for example, smoke or fire with a specific spacing and type of spacing most of the time. And you cannot stick to it most of the time if you're not given the task to change it. For example, fire usually, if there is no insanely fast speed, it will move at a certain speed and have certain acceleration, and I don't know, something like that can be very fast, something like that can be immediately medium, and for very slow changes, something like that. But again, there is no rules here. And if I'm trying something new, I will always try to change spacing or to change the exposure and see if it looks better or not. And usually you establish the overall spacing if first 3-5 frames, and they give you a sense of spacing for the remaining part of the animation. Since the speed of the elements don't change unless there's a new force. So for example, there wasn't a huge gust of winds before, and then you have a huge gust of wind, then of course there will be change in spacing, and a substantial change in spacing. But if there is no new forces, the spacing that you have set up in your animation will change logically to decelerating, a slight acceleration, but essentially you set up the spacing for the animation with first frames. So again, as I said, the first one shows us gradual motion and is very good for loops, while the second one shows us very quick acceleration and helps to show sort of the external force influencing something. So essentially what you can do is you can combine these two and use them to animate for loop. You can animate it with dots or anything. So let's see, I've had this example. I'm just gonna find it. It was Vero. One second. Fire. Is it this? I doubt it. No, is this sapphire? Probably here. No? Yes? No? One second. Oh, here it is. Found it. I did a quick demo. So you can simplify your fire, water, whatever with simple dots to define the overall spacing and even design. So for example, right here we have several dots and they define the extremes of the edges. So every edge is defined by two dots, so kind of the extreme and the lower point of the edge, and then you design over it and use that to define how it moves without going into details. And it also helps you understand what is pose in motion. For example, here the pose in motion is that we have this dot, and this dot has a different speed. It moves slightly faster. So we've got the one on the left and it moves like this. So I've got an acceleration, deceleration towards the end, while the one on the right goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So they catch up, but the initial spacing is faster for this one, and there is delay. So there is delay between this one and this one. There is delay between this edge and this edge. And this helps us create a nice, interesting balance. And there is also a substantial difference in speed that again helps us bring variety into animation. So everything doesn't move at the same speed. We've got a fast motion, we've got slow motion, and we've got kind of a medium motion. And then again, we try to create contrast. And then go again. And that way, you can very easily create loops because you don't have to think much. For example, you can do start like this with a simple dot. For example, let's pick 10 frames as in the animation, and let's animate a simple dot looping, and we'll loop it over 2 loops, so it will start moving in one loop, but it will only stop moving in the second part of the loop. So it will decelerate and disappear here. So that way our motion is more connected, because our motion is not just a part of a single loop and then it just ends. It extends into the second part of the loop, and that's very good for creating that smooth transition between the start and the end of the loop. And for example, we see that we can't put the dot here because otherwise it will repeat this one. So let's put it slightly higher. And again, we're trying to create a nice design, so we've got proportional relationships. So we get a small mass, we get a medium mass or big one, and it's almost like 2 and 1. So it's the rule of thirds in a sense. So let's put it here and then animate it while trying to make it interesting and keep a nice design. And we can give it a more interesting wave-like motion. And again, we see we've finished this loop. We'll extend the motion to the second part of the loop. Now we see that it kind of appears out of nowhere, and for example, we've defined that the bottom of the fire is here. So let's put the motion back. So we've got this kind of spacing and it accelerates a bit, so let's go backwards and add a few frames until it reaches the bottom. Kind of works. Now let's see. So this area is kind of empty, so we need to add something here, maybe a mass here. Again, having that delay will, okay, it should be lower. Good animators put the bottom line somewhere, so let's be good animators. Okay, so this is the bottom of the fire. Gotcha. So we need to put it, okay, so there is another mass here, so maybe we can put something here again, keeping that interesting relationship. Again, we've exceeded the number of frames, so let's animate further in the loop. So we've got these invisible guidelines all across the animation. Essentially now all we have to do is connect it, and yeah, I gotta upload it on my YouTube. Yes. So now all we need is to connect it. Think about design. So The entire point of that is if you are having trouble figuring out pose design, spacing, timing, all this variety stuff, thinking about all these design principles, you can just leave it all behind and focus on one thing. For example, how can you focus on spacing and spacing only? How can you focus entirely on design? For example, for design it's very good to have thumbnails. For spacing, this method is very good because it helps you eliminate everything else aside from that and focus only on the most important principles. And of course, it doesn't mean that you don't have to think, it just means that you think on one thing at a time. For example, if we really think about that, we can add more variety to the animation by having these dots on different lines. So now they kinda on the same line. And we can put this one slightly to the right. For example, let's do that to make it more interesting. So it goes here, it goes here, and we can add wave motion to it, we can let it vibrate, whatever, to make it more dramatic, interesting, varied, anything really. Let's see, does that work? It seems to work. And the biggest upside of that, especially as you're trying to create something new, is it doesn't take a lot of time. It really doesn't. It's very fast thing. You can animate it easily and very fast. It's just a dot. Okay, let's go back and animate something on top of that. Okay, have the same number of frames, we're just connecting that and finding interesting design. Now we're focusing on how to make that work as fire. What is fire? How we can create some interesting design here. Again, you don't have to stick to it completely, it's just a guideline for you that helps you understand the overall basics of the motion. So once you have that, you can change it up, you can add stuff, you can remove stuff, and basically do anything you want. And I guarantee it will be a bit easier to think about all this stuff when you have something. It's like trying to start drawing when you have a blank sheet of paper and when you have something in mind. I'm used to this kind of sharp shake language, so that's mostly what I use. Okay, now we can break up the particle. Okay, and now we see that after the loop we go to the right here, so we should start slowing down and again creating this kind of transition. So we go from one side to the other side, so we need to slow down and then we can go to the other side. So we slow down that edge and start accelerating it to the right. And again here we should connect that so that the loop makes sense. And here we go. We can refine that, work a bit on the design and make it in the proper loop. But overall, this is a very fast way of working with loops. Don't know how long it took. It's like half an hour now, less than that. Like 30 minutes, 20 minutes, I don't know. So yeah, it's a very good way to iterate on the motion and find ways to quickly work it out. Can notice some fast changes here, so we should put it slightly lower. Yeah, and that should work. Bye bye, bye bye, Chess. Yeah, try it out. I'm sure you'll get some nice results. Okay, add some particles here. Just refining it a bit. See, it goes to the left and then back to the right, to the right, to the left. To change it here to get a smooth transition. Now let's see where we add a bit more mass. We can start accelerating to the left here to make it more gradual and checking the in-betweens. Right now they're a bit messy. Slowing down when we go to the left, accelerating a bit. Again, paying attention to the in-betweens. Right here, it's not a good job of in-betweening. It should be over here. And here we need to slow down because this one and this one are very close to each other. We need to slow down and then we can change directions. So that was it for slopes, fire, and all that stuff. But you can basically apply it to anything. Oh, I notice. Here we accelerate a bit to the right and then go back to the left. So we need to push it a bit back here. And if we want, we can push that mass here and create a new bigger particle instead of making it smaller. Keep it on similar level, push it up, push it up. And we can make some fun changes with transform and combine several loops. So let's export these. Best naming convention ever. So any questions? Maybe someone is wondering something else about effects or has a specific interest shot in mind. How do I do such shapes? I mean, if you've seen it, it's just a bunch of curves. I mean, the real answer is I just sketch a lot and study shapes within fire, water, or whatever elements I'm trying to draw. For example, for the fire, for the stylized kind of western or right look along curves and kind of the opposite shapes, so concave and convex curves right next to each other, having different types of forms, bigger, smaller, medium ones, and creating a nice flow is usually the way to go, and most of them are hardwired in my memory by now, so I just sketch them out without planning because I've sketched them out millions of times, or at least a couple thousands for sure. There's a solid base of design underneath it, but at this point you just don't think about it much. And of course you can always create more interesting shapes if you think about it or design it specifically. Falling boulders, rocks breaking apart. Resource. Okay, let's do one by one. How would I approach animating falling boulders, rocks breaking apart? First, I would find a good reference. Second is just animating a bouncing ball with extra steps. So basically, falling boulders or rocks don't have anything different from anything else falling or breaking apart, but they are very easier to draw in a way, because all you have to do is being able to draw boxes, and again keep in mind variety aspect. So we have this kind of the overall shape maybe. something like this. This is our boulder. Or for example, we can have a major curve here, and this is our boulder. So if it breaks apart, then there's crevices and all the stuff going through it, and they usually go in sort of so it's like a thunderbolt going in different directions. So we've got a major breaking point, and we've got smaller ones going to the sides. And then again, one side goes up if it's like ground breaking apart. One side may go down. Some stuff on the edges will break into medium pieces and very small pieces between them. So we've got bigger pieces, small stuff between these biggest pieces. I've got the overall large chunk that defines the edge of breaking, and that will give us the overall idea of the animation. And for the spacing and the timing, it's just essentially bouncing ball. So if the ball breaks on contact, or if it breaks from contact, so if it breaks on contact, then we have 1 or 2 frames of the boulder or whatever, so it hits the ground, 1 or 2 frames, it preserves its form, and then on the second frame it shatters into pieces. And if the pieces are far enough from each other, they don't even have to form the exact same boulder they were shattered from. So for example, you may have this kind of boulder, and it can break into this part. Let's try something better. And they don't have to form the initial rock, because if it's fast enough, nobody will notice the difference. And usually when it falls, if we are following real life logic, it will rarely fall like straight down. It will always roll a bit or rotate a bit in the air, and these pieces, they won't just go straight in this direction. So we've got falling, then it falls, the debris are being pushed to the sides, and they are rotating a bit in the air, so they will rotate in this direction and they will rotate in that direction a bit, so along this axis and along that axis. You can make this rotation subtle, or you can make it more noticeable, but that's basically it. And yeah, good references, because you don't have to imagine everything. You can rely on references. You can use references from animation, anime, Western stuff. And yeah, if you really want me to break down how rocks and boulders break apart, yeah, we can do that maybe after I answer the other 2 questions. Are there any resources that you suggest to go deeper into learning FX animation? Depends on how much money do you have and how much time do you have. So if you have a lot of time, I suggest breaking down stuff on Sakugaboru. I've linked I don't know where, in Inspiration or in Study Challenge, references to effects artists and their blogs. They have a lot of material. Aside from that, there is Gumroad from Quentin Cardinier, and he has some stuff, very good lessons. There is VFX Apprentice, there is Artifix. Okay, so this is Quentin. It's a French name, don't even bother. There is VFX Apprentice. There is my channel, of course. Yeah, that's a good compilation. Debris Effects Sakuga. Aside from that, there is also a good live action site for effects. They have effects packs for cinema, and that's a great resource to do studies and breakdowns. Let's see. One good resource, which is quite funny, is Shutterstock. Shutterstock has this video footage search feature, and you can basically look up any effect or any scene there, and these videos you can right click and download it, so you don't have to worry about downloading plugins for downloading it from YouTube or anything like that. You can just right click. If you don't use it in commercial work, like as it is for studies, it's okay. You don't break any rules or laws by that. And that's epic. And it's very, very good for references. Aside from that, there is real-time effects. Yeah, their stock videos are a good library of regular motion because you have everything shot in okay resolution. You can download it, you can sort it quite well, and there is no bullshit. Aside from that, what resources are good? I had something, I just have to look it up. I also have a library of Sakugabori effects, but pretty much you can build your own, and I'd argue that's better, because when you build your own library of effects and references, you create first off a guide for what you want to achieve and what you want to do. Second, you remember them, because if you just download something and look up something, you forget it quite easily, and if you spend your time and energy searching for something, you usually remember it way better, which is good. It's pretty good. For good shape language, I'd recommend Alex Redfish. How do you manage studies and practical application? That's a good question, and I'm not the best person to ask it. In my case, I do a lot of stuff aside from work, and I'd argue that I don't do enough still. But since I do a lot of stuff aside from work, it gives me time to experiment, try things out, and learn stuff. The downside of that is that you don't have much time for anything else in life, because if you have a full-time job, 8 hours a day, and you do, like, for example, just 2 hour studies on sketches or everything else, that's 10 hours, plus you have to eat, and cook and clean, which is 1 or 2 hours plus, so it's 12 hours, and you've left 4 hours or something like that for everything else, and all your chores and taxes. It's sad. realistically, and if you have the will to do it, ideally you should be able to learn on your job. So you should be able to have time and grab references for the things you don't know, grab references and study something for the things that you work on. For example, if you have something that you've animated before, then it should take less time, but you can take that time and use it to, for example, learn the aspects that you're trying to work on a bit better. For example, if you're an okay or somewhat okay with drawing fire and you have a fire scene, you can do it faster, or you can do it with the same time but use that additional time to get more in depth into fire animation. And the same thing for anything else. It's just about how you manage your time. And I'm not the best person to ask that. I just don't have a lot of scenes in life. Oh, I found the library. Yeah, this is a good library of references for cinema stuff. Splashes, explosions. They're on a black background, so they're very crisp and very easy to study. Oh yeah, so next question, explosion. So I do have some experience with explosions. How much? I mean, depends what kind of explosions. So the last scene that I've done is this explosion, this one. This one's pretty complex. There is no camera work still. So for explosions, one of the most important things is trying to understand the overall spacing, timing, and form. So for different types of explosions, and depending on the way you're trying to animate it, it can be achieved essentially differently. So I'm trying mostly to do very volumetric, complex, realistic style of explosions. However, I've done some more stylized ones, but I tend to work in a more realistic fashion. For the explosions, the most important thing is essentially having that initial acceleration. So, for example, here we have initial explosion, build up, and then we get a fast change, quickly settles, and then we've got a slow motion. So this kind of type of region is very important. We can do anything really, and it all relies on getting a very good, nice build-up. So build-up is very important. It's as important as the explosion itself. So how does the energy for the explosion builds up in your shot? For example, is it additional elements, other sparks, or any elements preceding the explosion? For example, one of the explosions that I made relied on this kind of lines coming towards the center, igniting the spark. And then we've got an initial acceleration, and then a very quick change of masses. And then we need to decide how we can settle the explosion. So, for example, how we can settle that? So the energy is pushing it up and to the sides. So these masses will probably move to the sides relative to each other, but we can add additional motion. So what are the additional motions? We can let some masses drag so they can swirl and go in the opposite direction. We can add new masses pushing from the center or from other parts of explosions, for example. And we create a new mass going from here and pushing these masses away. This is one way. So it's kind of a new mass created here. It pushes other masses away, and you have get this kind of explosion. We can just use rotation, or we can suck masses into the explosion, so creating some sort of vacuum in the center. Settling explosion without ending it in a million frames. So if you have very slow motion, you can consider limiting the frame rate. So usually the first part, like this part, can be animated on ones or twos, but the later deceleration can easily be animated with more extreme frames on anything from 3s to 6 for very giant explosions. And that way you can kind of limit the number of frames that you use. The second thing is that in anime they tend to cut. So when the explosion ends, you cut to a different angle. You cut to anything else other than the explosion in the same position, angle, and whatever. And that's because animating a slowdown for explosion or animating the explosion disappearing is very time consuming and rarely gives anything to the story. So almost all explosions are not animating towards the disappearance of smoke, or you just use opacity, so you just reuse the opacity of the smoke as it slows down and sort of cheats the way out of it, cheats the way out of animating. Like, this is 3 frames, we've settled, we can do a very slow motion. This is not a very interesting explosion, nonetheless. So the point is that you can use limited frame rate, you can change cuts, or you can use like covering camera, so the explosion can create waves or smoke that starts to cover camera, and you use that to change the screen to get away without animating it any further, or gradually reducing the frame rate. So start on 2s, go to 3s, 4s, and on 6. Yay! Hi Alicia! And she left. Okay, any other questions? Oh, actually, the very good way to look into that is explosions from, I don't know if you've seen Azo Ken, but they have a very good way of showing how you can use very limited frame rates and slow down to get away with minimal animation. Where the hell? Okay, I'm pretty sure it was here. Oh yeah, oh yeah. And so if you go here to 0, 57 seconds to 57. You can find very good way of limiting your frames and choosing keyframes for explosions. And you can really just get away with 5 to 6 frames per explosion if you're animating it in a limited fashion. It won't be a very interesting explosion, except for forms, but still. Back. Questions, answers, hanging out. No. Oh no. Okay. Everything's alright. What the hell? By the way, Jigs guys, how you doing? How's animation studies going and crack quiz, if you're still doing it? Oh, nice study, man. Okay, Maiden Abyss is wonderful and mind breaking at the same time. It's a tough love. Same, honestly. If you listen to it too long, you'll be done. My soul is drained. But sometimes I can just listen to it as music without thinking too much about the series. And then it's okay. I cry time. Hmm. I'll be also doing some stuff on forms and recording a video on it later for the course and maybe sharing it. So if you have anything you want to learn, yeah, be sure to ask. I may include it there. And let's do with no build up. Somewhere. No build up. Red one. Oh yeah, the red one clearly shows how important the slowdown and gradual acceleration is. And you can clearly see the weight on the second one. So very slow periods of changes and accelerations really matter in showing the weight. Oh damn, it's that part of the soundtrack playing. Let's do a very heavy ball. Very heavy ball. Difference in exposure? Yeah, we can do that. We can do the comparison between difference in exposure versus difference in spacing here. Let's do that too. So let's first do the difference in spacing and then the difference in exposure. Yeah, that's a pretty heavy ball. It works. Approaching fire as a bunch of paper and mash stripping blowing in the wind works. And it works even better if you add some particles breaking up from it. It's just, this analogy works very well in reality, whereas in animation it really isn't much easier to animate a bunch of paper mache strips than to animate fire. You can simplify it as a wave, and that's essentially the same scene as a bunch of paper mache strips blowing in the wind, just even more simple with one line. You can genuinely just do that. Like, okay, we have line, wave, wizard. No. We do one. Let's move it here. We do 2, 3, 4, 5. We need 1 or 2 frames. One frame was enough. Okay, so here's the wave. Chunky waves. Okay. We do copy, paste, reverse, transform. Modify, flip horizontally, delete, have the cycle, transform it, rotate it. Okay, let's transform it first, warp it next. Here you have a fire. Or smoke, depending on the speed and the shape language after you change it. With a very slow motion it will be more smoky and wispy. Okay, so we've animated this one only using spacing. Let's use exposure. With exposure it will look a bit junkier, that's for sure. Let's set it on force. On threes. On threes. Twos. rid of force. And let's make these ones on 2s too. And push these ones, the poses. So the problem is that if we do have a very small spacing and we use exposure, then we should make more contrasting poses, and the deceleration will still work worse. It will be more static and there will be less contrast. So when we're using exposure, we're losing subtlety, and that can be, yeah, bye bye mangoes. And that can be okay in some cases. In other cases, it may not be okay depending on the element. Usually for characters in anime style, since we're using very extreme poses and there isn't much stuff except Sagaga moving on screen, it works a bit better. But overall, yeah, using exposure is possible and it is way more time saving, but we also run into some issues. For example, we have to keep the spacing closer when we're animating like that. Like these moments where there is a bigger gap just don't work on higher exposure because we're not using a very stylized kind of spacing for the other parts. Can definitely make it work a bit better. Let's see what else. Let's use ones and only 2s for the fastest parts. This can work on 2s, this can work on 3s. Because spacing is relatively slow. So the smaller the spacing, the bigger the exposure we can get away with. Yeah. Good night, Jigs. Yeah. So if the frames are very, very close apart. Okay. Okay. I was mistaken. Yeah. So yeah, if the frames are very, very close to each other, we can use slower spacing. Oh, okay. We can use bigger exposure because the motion is relatively slow and because there won't be huge gaps. So the problem with using exposure is that when we look at the motion, there is a gap between frames, and the bigger the gap, the harder it is to sort of reimagine what the motion was for the brain, because when we're working with lower frame rate, essentially what we're doing is we're trying to in between the motion in our head. So if the frames are very, very close to each other, it becomes way easier to understand how it is going, and sort of it reads much better than when they're further apart. So you can get away with higher exposure there. Another instance is, for example, very fast action. You can get away with higher exposure there at some moments because you don't understand what the fuck is going on anyway. so yeah, you can just get away with a few poses. Okay, the next aspect that I wanted to touch on about is material. So this is probably the least talked about. I don't know. So let's animate a ball and then animate a tail on the ball. So depending on the material, scenes bend differently. So for example, you can have silk, you can have metal, you can have, I don't know, linen, cotton, and other stuff, and they have different weight and they bend in different way, and there's barely any like instances where you have to animate specific materials, and that's good for animators because it is very hard. But in general, it is good to understand how it works, just for the sake of understanding how you can animate different stuff and how you can get specific look. So depending on the material, what changes is how much the material compresses, how much and how fast it reacts to new forces, and how fast it can get back into its initial shape. So let's animate different tails for the ball. So there is a ball and there is a tail attached to it. And then the question is, depending on the material, how the tail can react and what is the difference in reaction. And let's use a simplified model. So instead of drawing the entire tail, we'll draw segments. So like 2 segments of the tail. So for example, let's animate something rigid. So if something is attached to the ball in a rigid way, it won't have much of a delay in reaction. So as soon as the ball starts moving, it starts moving. properly. Yay, secondary mode. Yay! See ya, John. So this basically gives us very limited secondary motion. And I've lost a bit of the length here. Even more extreme example would be no secondary motion at all. Let's do something else. Let's start adding a proper delay. And let's start adding more soft materials to the equation. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Okay. So very soft material will tend to stay intact longer and it will bend easier. So you see, especially at the tip, we see how it reacts. It tends to stay. And it will react with a higher delay. So it will get into its initial shape after more stiff material. And again, the part that is attached to the ball will react faster, while the other part will react slower. Increase the delay here. guess we can limit the amplitude here in case it be too far. Okay, and we can do something even more soft and bending. Let's do something very soft. slower. Yay! And now notice the only real difference that it makes. Okay, bye Manly. So, could someone tell me what's the big difference between these three examples? So we have 1, 2, 3. Okay. Yeah, but there is a very simple thing. So, if you look at these two animations and imagine every scene as dots, so 2 dots. So, the most apparent thing that changes is the delay between the dots. So you have the softness of the material is measured by how fast different parts of this material react to each other. So these two almost have no delay. So the end of the material reacts as fast or almost as fast as the point where the material is attached. Here though, it reacts a bit slower, and the softer the material is, the bigger the delay between this point and that point. So this point, let's look at the spacing. So this point hasn't started moving yet, almost. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Whereas this point reacts way faster. So the difference in materials is the speed at which different parts of material react to force. So if you want something to be very light and very breezy, sort of, you should increase the delay. So the long dress, the very light dress, will move very smoothly along the path because it will have a very big delay between each part of the dress, whereas a sleek leather jacket will react quite fast to the wind or to anything else, and that's essentially the point. So depending on the material, the biggest difference that you can note is the delay between parts. And you can apply that to hair, you can apply that to clothes, you can apply that basically to anything, because it is the same for character animation. So, and that's essentially it. So the difference is the delay, by how many frames, by how much in terms of spacing it is delayed. Let's look here, for example, for comparison. You see, it barely moves. Let's make it very small dots. Like this spacing is smaller and closer with each frame than this one, and especially than this one. Okay, so the next tip I was thinking about is the boring one. So consistent spacing. It's pretty straightforward. If your spacing has structure, and if you are aiming for a more specific kind of idea and type of motion, then you'll get a better spacing. So let's define it first. So consistent spacing inconsistent. Consistent spacing is defined by the fact that you have an acceleration, deceleration, and changes happen predictable in a controlled fashion. So if you have acceleration, you have acceleration. If you have deceleration, you have deceleration. You can have fast acceleration, deceleration. That's consistent. and that's okay. Whereas inconsistent spacing would be something like this. So we're starting to accelerate, decelerate, accelerate, decelerate, accelerate, decelerate, accelerate, decelerate. So this is inconsistent spacing. And this is also inconsistent spacing, because you have fast changes and small changes. So there is no inertia, there is no reaction. So with every action there is a reaction, and then here there is a action, there is acceleration, but there is no reaction, it instantly goes away. And if we animate something using this spacing, we'll see the difference. Okay. So that was consistent spacing. Now let's go to inconsistent spacing. Let's have fun. Yeah, let's move this one just to make it more clear that it's not the intention, but rather that it was just done poorly. sort of like this. Yay, bye bye. Bye Bing. Okay. So, consistent spacing versus inconsistent spacing. Inconsistent spacing can be useful too in very specific occasions. So, if you want to animate erratic, chaotic action, if you want to animate effects that are not controlled, or to make very eerie sort of horror film effect, like a lot of Okiura effects are chaotic. No. So inconsistent spacing is when you have changes that happen frantically. So, for example, you have a gradual acceleration, so with each frame the spacing increases. And if you have an inconsistent acceleration, you accelerate, then decelerate, accelerate, decelerate, accelerate, decelerate, accelerate, decelerate. So you don't have a consistent change. It's like moving with no plan, sort of like this scene. So it's like you're going here, going there, going here, going there, and you don't know where to go, and that's inconsistent spacing. So, for example, here you have this spacing, and then it's very small, and then it's bigger again, and then it's small again, and then it's big again, and then it's small again. And that can be useful in certain very rare occasions. Again, to make motion more realistic sometimes, for character acting and all this stuff. It can be used when the animation should be chaotic, so something very uncontrollable. You can reinforce the idea of force, energy, something being outside of character's control by having it move more chaotically and use more inconsistent sort of more unpredictable spacing, and that reinforces the idea of that scene being uncontrollable, chaotic, more foreign to the character. So we have that. Variety. So variety is a big topic. So let's tackle variety in the simplest way possible. Variety in timing. Yes, no. limit the speed. Increase the delay. What everyone's doing. Yeah. It's basically creating delay and adding variety to the motion so that it all doesn't blend into one thing, and making sure that the particles don't disappear at the same time, that you have uh, enough time on screen for the changes and for the read. So you want to make sure that the particles don't feel like they light up as a single entity and they don't disappear at the same time if they're not linked. And we can even increase delay at the bottom as a finishing touch. Essentially it's just about contrast, but whereas we usually talk about contrast in terms of forms or color, it's the contrast in terms of spacing and timing. is very dissatisfied. I imagine it as a burst of, I don't know, ground, debris, whatever. Oh. Okay, let's stop here for now. Okay, so do you guys want something? Yay! Glad you like it, Jigs. I haven't been streaming in a while, so it's pretty chaotic. Let's be real. Um, yeah. Aside from that, I didn't have much planned for today. It's just making the tips. I'm gonna refine it, cause right now it may not be as clear as I want it to be, and I want it to be as clear as the tutorial above. So yeah, I can see that consistent spacing needs some clarification, some notes. Here I'll do the diagram and refine some of these, and for the variety and timing I'll do a simplified example, and then more complex examples, how you can apply it and how you can build animations around it. As you can see, you can basically do everything with dots. Like here it's like a burst of anything. You can apply forms of boulders, rocks, and treat it as boulders going up into the air. You can use it and, for example, treat it as water or as earth flying up. It's pretty much base for any of these kind of animations. And the same thing for loops and fire animations. It's pretty versatile. Yeah. I mean, definitely adding gravity and adding the slowdown adds a feeling of weight, since it implies that the objects and whatever these dots represent have weight and are affected by gravity. And if you don't have that, it implies that either something is lighter than the air or it's not on Earth or isn't affected by gravity. So that's a nice thing as well. Aside from that, not much. Overall, you can do many things like that. It's just a nice exercise trying to understand how much you can simplify what you already know, like how much you can simplify the motion of the character, the wind, fire, smoke. Essentially with smoke you can use the same scene but use the contours and outline the motion of internal shapes with that, or you can just use that to plan the overall masses as the smoke expands and then just draw on top of that. The same scene would be to use short edges instead of drawing the full edge, just to plan stuff. Christmas mood, Christmas mood. Oh, both. So, for today, fixed animation work, do you send a demo reel for your animation to studios recruiting, or do you get contacted on social media? Since I have a lot of animations on Twitter, and since I have a big portfolio on ArtStation, I'm mostly contacted from these two sites, and if the projects are in similar style or in similar line of work, I rarely get asked to show a reel, since they can already see what I can do either on Twitter or on ArtStation. Some studios may ask for animation reel if they either have contacted you from someone else and they haven't seen your portfolio, or if the style is vastly different and they want to clarify that you will be able to tackle that kind of style. So I was asked for the reel once, and I am not asked for it most of the projects, yeah. But it's very nice to have a reel. Anyway, it's fun. It's such a pity that when you're doing commercial work, you basically cannot show most of your works until quite late after the project. And it depends on the project, of course. For example, for animation series, TV series, it's easier. For some other stuff like games, it's harder, especially big games, since it takes a lot of time to release the game. And again, games and animation movies are the worst. It takes so much time. So much time, man. Okay, I'll stop the recording, and if someone wants to chat,